Have you ever noticed how certain people can make you feel guilty for saying no? How they manipulate your emotions so subtly that you don't even realize you're being controlled until it's too late. If you've ever found yourself questioning your own sanity after a conversation, if you've felt like you were walking on eggshells around someone, or if you've noticed that you always give in to certain people's demands, even when something inside you screams that you shouldn't, then you are not alone in this unsettling experience. Millions of people around the world live daily under the invisible weight of manipulators who use sophisticated psychological masks to exert control over others. What makes this reality even more disturbing is that these people are often not strangers in the shadows, but individuals close to us, people we trust, work with, or even those who claim to love us. The human capacity to influence others through psychological manipulation is one of the oldest traits of our species. Since the dawn of civilization, when small groups of hunter-gatherers depended on cooperation to survive, some individuals discovered they could gain advantages not through brute force or superior skill, but by manipulating the emotions and perceptions of their peers. These early manipulators learned to use language, facial expressions, and body gestures not only to convey information, but to alter others' mental states in ways that benefited them. As societies became more complex, these manipulation techniques became more refined and sophisticated, evolving into true arts of psychological control that now permeate every aspect of our social lives. What few people understand is that we live in an era where psychological manipulation has reached levels of sophistication never before seen in human history. Our interconnected world, saturated with information and dominated by algorithms that study our behavior, has created the perfect environment for manipulators to refine their techniques to an almost scientific degree. They no longer rely solely on intuition or natural charisma. They can study behavioral patterns, emotional vulnerabilities, and psychological triggers with a precision that would have been unthinkable for our ancestors. This evolution in the art of manipulation represents one of the most underestimated threats to individual autonomy and psychological well-being in our contemporary society. The first mask we must recognize is the selfless savior, one of the most dangerous because it exploits our fundamental need for connection and gratitude. This person appears in your life like an angel sent from above, offering help exactly when you need it most. They solve problems you didn't even know you had, anticipate your needs, and always seem to have the perfect solution. At first, you feel incredibly lucky to have found someone so generous and thoughtful. However, over time, you begin to realize that every favor comes with an implicit emotional price. When you need to make an independent decision or express a differing opinion, the selfless savior subtly reminds you of all the sacrifices they've made for you. They don't directly ask for gratitude, but their body language, melancholic sighs, and seemingly innocent comments create an atmosphere of emotional debt that becomes increasingly suffocating. The ultimate goal is to make you emotionally dependent, unable to question their decisions or act autonomously without overwhelming guilt. The second mask is the infallible expert, who builds influence by manipulating your sense of competence and knowledge. This person positions themselves as an unquestionable authority in multiple areas of life, always ready with statistics, scientific studies, and historical examples that support their opinions. They create a dynamic where questioning their expertise is equivalent to demonstrating ignorance or lack of intellectual sophistication. The infallible expert uses complex technical language, obscure academic references, and unwavering confidence to intimidate others into accepting their views without question. When you express doubts or offer alternative perspectives, they don't argue directly, but instead subtly question your ability to understand the complexity of the issue. Phrases like, well, it's more complicated than it seems, or you need to understand the full historical context, become tools to undermine your confidence in your own judgment. The result is that you gradually stop trusting your analytical ability and become dependent on this person's intellectual validation to make important decisions. The third mask, perhaps the most insidious of all, is the perpetual victim. This person has turned suffering into a manipulative art form, using real or exaggerated pain as a tool to control the behavior of others. What makes this mask particularly effective is that there is often a genuine foundation of suffering that has been strategically amplified and instrumentalized. The perpetual victim always has a tragic story to tell, a recent injustice to lament, or a health issue that conveniently worsens when they need attention or want to avoid responsibilities. They don't ask for things directly, but create scenarios where you feel morally obligated to offer them. When you fail to meet their implicit needs, they don't express anger openly, but instead a deep sadness and melancholic resignation that makes you feel like a heartless monster. The dynamic becomes toxic because any attempt to set boundaries or express your own needs is reinterpreted as yet another source of suffering for this already deeply wounded person. Let me pause for a moment to ask you directly, which of these masks have you encountered in your own life? That uncomfortable feeling when you can't quite name what's going on, but you know something is off in the dynamic with certain people? I know many of us keep these experiences to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming paranoid or because we doubt our own perception. But your intuitions are valid and likely more accurate than you realize. Share in the comments. I recognize the mask of the in someone in my life. Your honesty may help others feel less alone in this experience and might be the first step toward breaking these cycles of manipulation. The fourth mask is the instant intimate friend, a strategy that exploits our fundamental need for belonging and social connection. This person has an uncanny ability to make you feel special and chosen from the very first meeting. They share personal secrets prematurely, create an artificial sense of intimacy through strategic confessions, and show an almost obsessive interest in your life. The instant intimate friend makes you feel like you've met your soulmate, someone who finally understands you in a way no one else ever has. However, this accelerated intimacy is a calculated strategy to break down your natural defenses and create an emotional bond that can be exploited later. Once you let your guard down and begin to trust this person, they gradually start to use the personal information you shared as leverage to influence your decisions. The goal is not genuine friendship, but the creation of a sense of mutual obligation that can be manipulated as needed. The fifth mask is the moral judge, who builds influence by manipulating your conscience and sense of right and wrong. This person positions themselves as the voice of ethics and morality in any group or relationship, always ready to judge others' actions by a supposedly superior moral standard. The moral judge doesn't use logical arguments or rational persuasion, but instead appeals to shame and guilt to modify behavior. They create rigid categories of acceptable and unacceptable behavior and use moral approval or disapproval as rewards and punishments. When you act according to their expectations, you are a good person, but when you stray from their norms, you become selfish, insensitive, or morally deficient in some way. The power of this mask lies in the fact that most people have a deep need to see themselves as ethically consistent and morally upright, and the moral judge exploits this vulnerability to exert behavioral control. The sixth mask is the protective mentor, who combines elements of authority with paternalistic care to create a dynamic of dependence. This person presents themselves as more experienced and wise, genuinely concerned about your well-being and personal development. The protective mentor offers unsolicited advice, interferes in your decisions under the pretext of protecting you from mistakes, and gradually undermines your confidence in your own ability to navigate life's challenges. They craft a narrative in which you are vulnerable and inexperienced, while they are strong and knowledgeable, creating a dynamic where questioning their guidance is seen as ingratitude or immaturity. The protective mentor uses phrases like, "I just want what's best for you," or "you'll thank me later," to justify their constant interference in your autonomy. The result is that you become progressively less able to make independent decisions and more dependent on this person's validation and approval. The seventh and final mask is the charismatic revolutionary, who exploits our need for purpose and meaning to create devoted followers. This person presents themselves as a visionary who sees truths others cannot, offering an alternative narrative of reality that is both threatening and hopeful. The charismatic revolutionary creates a sense of urgency and importance around their ideas, making followers feel that they are part of something greater and more meaningful than their ordinary lives. They divide the world into us versus them, creating a group identity that depends on opposition to external forces. Questioning their ideas is not just disagreement, it's betrayal of the movement and the values it represents. The charismatic revolutionary uses the passion and idealism of their followers as fuel for their own goals, creating a dynamic where personal sacrifice for the cause becomes a virtue, while critical thinking becomes a weakness or even a form of treason. What makes these masks particularly dangerous in the modern era is how they've adapted to the new realities of our social and technological lives. In a world where most of our interactions take place through screens and digital platforms, manipulators have learned to use these tools to amplify the power of their psychological masks. The selfless savior can now display generosity through digital gestures that remain permanently recorded for future reference. The infallible expert has instant access to infinite information to support any argument. The perpetual victim can document and share their suffering in ways that generate waves of sympathy and emotional support, Each of these masks has become more powerful and harder to detect in an environment where the nuances of non-verbal communication are filtered through digital interfaces. Moreover, we live in a society that paradoxically celebrates individuality while creating enormous pressures for social conformity. This contradictory environment creates psychological vulnerabilities that manipulators can increasingly exploit. Our need for social validation, amplified by social media and digital performance culture, makes us more susceptible to the influence of those who seem to offer acceptance, recognition, or belonging. Simultaneously, the growing complexity of modern life creates a sense of uncertainty and anxiety that drives us to seek authority figures or guides who can provide direction and safety. Detecting these masks requires developing a form of emotional intelligence that goes beyond what we traditionally teach about human relationships. We need to learn not only to recognize what people say and do, but also the subtle patterns in how they make you feel over time. Skilled manipulators know how to create specific emotional experiences in their victims, and these experiences follow predictable patterns that can be identified if we know what to look for. Feelings of guilt after interactions that should have been neutral, the gradual erosion of your self-confidence, increasing emotional dependence on a specific person, or the sense that you are constantly walking on eggshells are all warning signs that deserve serious attention. The first step to protecting yourself from these masks is to develop what we might call healthy emotional skepticism. This doesn't mean becoming cynical or distrusting of everyone, but rather learning to question your own emotional reactions and examine whether they are proportionate and appropriate to the actual circumstances. When you feel excessively guilty, anxious, or dependent after interactions with certain people, those emotions may be artificially induced through manipulation techniques. Learning to create mental space between your emotions and your actions allows you to assess situations more objectively and make decisions based on your own rational analysis rather than on emotional impulses that may have been planted by others. The second crucial aspect of protection against manipulation is the strengthening of one's own identity and independent value system. Manipulators seek out people who have uncertainties about themselves, their abilities, or their core values, because these uncertainties create openings that can be exploited. Developing a clear understanding of who you are, what you value, and what your personal boundaries are creates a solid foundation that is much harder to undermine by external influences. This does not mean rigidity or being closed off to new ideas, but rather having a core of principles and self-knowledge that serves as an anchor during emotional storms created by others. Emotional education should also include the development of the ability to establish and maintain healthy boundaries, a skill that our culture often fails to teach adequately. Many people grow up believing that setting boundaries is selfish or cruel, when in reality, it is a fundamental necessity for healthy relationships. Manipulators depend on this cultural confusion about boundaries to create dynamics in which you feel obligated to accept behaviors that are harmful to your well-being. Learning to say no without elaborate explanations, to protect your emotional privacy until trust is genuinely established, and to recognize when someone is trying to make you feel guilty for exercising your autonomy are essential skills for modern life. Perhaps the most important aspect of protection against manipulation is understanding that recognizing these dynamics is not paranoia, but rather a necessary form of social intelligence to navigate a complex world. Our culture often romanticizes vulnerability and unconditional trust, but these qualities, although valuable in appropriate contexts, can become entry points for people who do not have good intentions. Developing the ability to be simultaneously open to genuine connections and cautious about manipulative dynamics is a skill that requires practice and continuous refinement. The irony of psychological manipulation is that it often disguises itself as the opposite of what it truly is. Control presents itself as care, exploitation as generosity, and domination as protection. This inversion of meaning is one of the reasons why it can be so difficult to recognize when we are being manipulated. Our natural tendency is to believe in people's stated intentions and interpret their behaviors charitably, especially when they display intense emotions or vulnerability. Skilled manipulators know how to exploit this fundamental human tendency to create dynamics in which questioning their motivations seems cruel or inappropriate. It is important to recognize that the ability to manipulate others is often developed as an adaptive response to previous trauma or toxic environments. Many manipulators were, at some point in their lives, victims of manipulation themselves and learned these strategies as a form of emotional or social survival. This does not excuse manipulative behavior, but it helps explain how these dynamics perpetuate through generations and communities. Understanding the origins of manipulation can help us respond more effectively when we encounter it, avoiding both victimization and the excessive demonization of those who use these strategies. Modern technology has created new challenges for detecting manipulation, because many of our interactions now take place in digital environments where traditional non-verbal cues are limited or absent. Online manipulators can create carefully crafted personas that are very different from the real personalities, and they can use algorithms and personal data to customize their approaches in ways that would be impossible in face-to-face interactions. This means we need to develop new forms of digital literacy that include not only the ability to evaluate online information, but also to recognize attempts at emotional manipulation through digital platforms. The future will likely bring even more sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation as our understanding of the human brain and social behavior continues to evolve. Artificial intelligence capable of analyzing emotional patterns, virtual reality that can create intense emotional experiences, and biotechnology that can directly influence mental states are all possibilities on the horizon. This makes it even more urgent for us to develop both individual skills and social structures necessary to protect psychological autonomy in a world where manipulation could become even more powerful and subtle. Education about psychological manipulation should be a fundamental part of the modern educational curriculum, as important as financial or sexual education. Children and adolescents are being exposed to sophisticated manipulation techniques early on through social media, targeted marketing, and complex social dynamics, but they rarely receive the conceptual tools needed to understand and navigate these influences. Teaching young people to recognize manipulation attempts, develop critical thinking about their emotional reactions, and establish healthy boundaries can create a generation more resistant to these forms of psychological exploitation. If these reflections touched on something you've been feeling, but perhaps haven't found the words to express, know that you are not alone. Recognizing manipulation in our lives is often the first step toward reclaiming our autonomy and psychological well-being. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for more authentic and healthy relationships. Every week, we meet here to explore together the complexities of human nature and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways to live amid the social dynamics that surround us. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth where we can learn to protect our psychological integrity while remaining open to genuine connections. Join us on this ongoing journey of self-discovery and emotional protection. The understanding of the 7 masks we explored today represents more than a simple list of behaviors to avoid. It offers a framework for understanding how power operates in human relationships in subtle and often invisible ways. When we learn to recognize these dynamics, we not only protect ourselves from manipulation, but also develop a greater capacity to create relationships based on mutual respect, honesty, and shared autonomy. The ultimate goal is not to make us distrustful or isolated, but rather more skilled at distinguishing between genuine connections and exploitative dynamics, allowing us to invest our emotional energy in relationships that truly nurture our growth and well-being. In a world where psychological manipulation is becoming increasingly sophisticated and pervasive, our ability to recognize and respond to these dynamics represents an essential form of emotional literacy for the 21st century. Just as we learn to read words and numbers, we must learn to read human intentions and the emotional patterns that reveal the true motivations behind others' actions. This skill is not paranoia or cynicism, but rather a necessary form of adaptive intelligence that allows us to navigate a complex social world while maintaining our integrity and personal autonomy.
When the Industrial Revolution erupted, a lot of people said that the only way to build an industrial society is to build an empire. Why? Because you need to control the sources of raw materials and the markets of the industry. So any country that industrialized, first Britain, but also then France and Belgium and Germany and Japan, they all built empires because people thought this is the only way to build an industrial society, with terrible consequences for hundreds of millions of people, not just in India, but in many other parts of the world. Another experiment was totalitarian regimes, that people thought the only way to build an industrial society is to build a totalitarian regime like Nazi Germany or like the Soviet Union, because they thought the only way to control the immense power of industry is if the government controls everything, the economy, society, culture, totalitarianism. Now we know that these were mistakes, that there are better ways to build industrial societies. It's a book about the long-term history of information networks, from the Stone Age to the age of AI. The idea is to understand the long-term processes that shape information networks and to learn from previous historical revolutions about what is the same and what is different, what is new about this revolution. We can learn a lot, for instance, from the process of the canonization of the Bible, about the process of canonizing AI, the fantasy of creating an infallible information technology that will always tell us the truth and that will be able to solve all our problems. It's of course a very old fantasy in human history. And looking at what happens previously when humans follow this fantasy can tell us at least some things about what is happening right now. The book is really about trying to understand the current AI revolution from a very long-term historical perspective.
How do you get to know your own mind? I practice Vipassana meditation. When I just began practicing, I became like this missionary. Everybody must go. And after some years of just, from empirical observation, it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. Find out what works for you, and then whatever it is. It can be a different tradition of meditation. It can be therapy. It can be art, it can be sport, it can be going to the woods for a period, whatever works for you, and then invest in it. And it is, in many ways, the most important thing you can give yourself.